Thank you all for making the time to be here. Special thanks to elected officials, city manager's office, and executive leadership team for attending. And this event wouldn't be possible without our diversity committee members, so thank you for that. All right, it's now my pleasure to introduce today's Hispanic Heritage Month speaker, Dr. Jerry Garcia. Dr. Garcia is a historian, author, and educator with over 15 years of experience teaching Mexican American, Latinx, and American history. He currently serves as resident faculty at Maricopa Community College and has also taught at Texas Christian University, Northern Arizona University, and Michigan State University. His research and publications explore the history of Mexican American and Latino communities, including the award-winning book, We Are Aztlan. Beyond the classroom, he helped establish the CMAR Museum of Chicano Latino Culture in Seattle, preserving and celebrating Latino heritage for future generations. Dr. Garcia's work reflects a deep commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and showcasing the important contributions of Latino communities in shaping our shared history. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jerry Garcia.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Hernandez. So I also want to thank Mr. Hernandez for reaching out to me and extending the invitation to be here, and also to Lejeune Boone, who I saw earlier, here somewhere, I imagine. But I'm very happy to be here with you folks today towards the tail end of Hispanic Heritage Month, which officially started on September 15th and goes through October 15th. But a lot of us in this room celebrate it every day, not just 1 month. So let me give you a little bit of insight to what I'm going to present today. As Mr. Hernandez mentioned, I'm a historian by training, so I see everything through history, no matter what it is. I look at it from a historical perspective. And so that's what I do with Hispanic Heritage Month. Obviously, there's a lot of culture to be celebrated, a lot of individuals to be celebrated, but there's also a lot of history to be celebrated as well. And so what I'm going to try to do today is combine a lot of that into today's presentation, looking at history and simultaneously trying to convey to you all some of the contributions that Chicanos and Latinos have made over the long array of history. And when we're talking about Chicanos, Latinos, we're talking about a history that runs 25 to 30,000 years. So it's a very, very long history. And I can't do justice in 45 minutes to that long array of time, but I'll do my best to give you some of the highlights today. But we are going to start off with culture, right? By the way, do you guys mind if I take a picture of you all for my file? So I can say I didn't have just 4 or 5 people show up. Right? I had a few more. You sure it's okay? All right. Found out a few minutes ago talking with Mr. Hernandez that you're all from different departments, and my slide says engineering, so sorry for leaving most of you out in regards to that. So now I know, right? Now I know that you're from all sectors of Glendale City. So, okay, so we are going to start off with some culture, right? And what I like to do is tell you a brief story. I can already tell that I'm going to be falling behind because as a historian, I get carried away with my little stories. And so when I was growing up as a kid, and by the way, I grew up in Washington State. That's my home state. My dad's from Mexico. My mom's actually from Phoenix. But way back in the day, they migrated. They were migrant workers. They followed the crops. And they ended up settling out in my home state where I was born, which is Washington State. And so that's why I often say that I'm from the northern borderlands, not the southern borderlands. And the book, I'm not sure if, I'll do a plug. Joe and I were talking about a book that I wrote a while back called We Are Aztlán. And it's about the northern borderland. It's about being a Chicano or Chicana growing up, not in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, or California, but in Washington State, right? Thousands of miles away from the traditional borderlands. So, long story short, growing up in that area, my father, who was Mexicano, right, all the way through, traditional Mexicano, loved Mexican music, and he loved corridos, which I'll explain here briefly in a second. But when I was like 10 or 11, he would wake us up every morning with a corrido, right? And I hated it, right? Because that was the alarm clock. Vámonos, right? It's time to go. And so I grew up not really liking him that much until I hit around 13 or 14 years of age. And the thing I noticed is that that's about the age where I started going to Mexican dances. And I noticed that a lot of the girls like corridos. They like to dance the cumbias and corridos. So then I started to like them, right? But the main reason why today it's my favorite genre is because the history that I have learned about the genre known as the corrido. The corrido is a wonderful genre, goes back hundreds of years. It's a form of oral history, oral tradition that comes out of Mexico and the Chicano community, still alive and well to this day. And so I've done a lot of research on corridos over the last 10 or 15 years. And I'm going to do another plug for another book that I'm writing. This is going to kind of sound strange to maybe some of you, but not to all of you. I also grew up in a cockfighting family. My dad was a gallero extraordinaire, right? And if you ever listen to corridos, a lot of them are about cockfighting, right? If you ever listen to corridos long enough, like I did, you'll figure out that, wow, they write a lot of corridos about cockfighting. And there's a reason for that, but I'm not going to get into it today, right? But the book that I'm writing on cockfighting, there's a whole chapter devoted to corridos and cockfighting. So this corrido, though, that I'm about to play for you, it's not the oldest corrido, but it's pretty old, though. It was written in 1928 about an actual event that took place. And then it was recorded by two sisters by the name of Las Hermanas Mendoza. Right? And they're a very famous group, a duet. They sung a lot of songs. But they sung this song. It's called El Corrido de Arnulfo González. Now, that song is very famous, right? And has been covered by hundreds of bands, right? A little bit earlier, our DJ in the back, David, was playing some Ramon Ayala, right? I recognized it right away. I almost did a little shake to it. But Ramon Ayala has covered this song, right? Vicente Fernandez has covered this song, right? Everybody has covered this song because it's very famous, right? But Las Hermanas Mendoza are one of the first that covered it. And what I like about it, it's old school, right? And what I mean by that is it's traditional. It's long before, like the accordion. If you understand a little bit about Mexican music, corridos, conjuntos, there's the accordion. You can hear it very easily. This predates the accordion, right? And it's a very simple version of it where all you hear is the harmony of the sisters and the corrido and a guitar, right? Now, it's about 3 minutes. I'm only going to play maybe about a minute of it so you can get a taste of it. And that's how we'll begin today's presentation with the Corrido de Arnulfo González by Las Hermanas Hernandez. And I think David's going to cue it up for us.
Con la muerte le amagó. Arnulfo se levantó
Okay, I had David cut it there. Obviously, it helps to know Spanish to understand a corrido, right? But let me give you just about a 30-second overview of the song. This is about two individuals, right? Arnulfo Gonzalez is the main protagonist, and he gets into a fight with a rural. A rural was a rural policeman in Mexico back in the old days, early part of the 20th century, going back to the late 19th century, created by Porfirio Diaz, the dictator of Mexico. And in this conflict, Arnulfo Gonzalez is challenged by the lieutenant, being harassed by him, right? And they just end up having a shootout, and they kill each other, right? And so a song was written about this event, true event. Now, most corridos are actual events that occurred. And the reason why they're so popular to this day is because a corrido can be written about anything, any moment in time, right? It can be written about the song we just heard. And by the way, Las Hermanas Mendoza is one of the few versions ever sung by women. Most of the cover songs of this song are by men, right? Or groups with men. This is one of the few versions that's covered by a female group or duet here. So a corrido then can be about any kind of moment in time. For example, there are corridos written about natural disasters in Mexico. There are corridos written about individuals. If you know a little bit about Mexican history, there are corridos written about Emiliano Zapata, Pancho Villa, right? There are corridos that are written about Porfirio Diaz, the dictator. There are corridos we'll bring into the United States. There are corridos written about Dolores Huerta, corridos written about Cesar Chavez. Okay, so corridos can be written about anything, any moment. And the beauty of the corrido then, especially during a time period we're talking about when they come out, is that Mexico, like in most places in the world, in the early 20th century, most of the population was illiterate, right? Just like here in the United States. So one of the ways then that corridos really helped the community was through this oral tradition, providing information to the community through a song that they could listen and understand. All right, so the corrido then has a long, long tradition. And the height of the corrido was the Mexican Revolution. That's the golden age of the corrido, where thousands of corridos were written. Because if you know the historical time period of the Mexican Revolution, the violent period that runs from 1910 to 1920, that's 10 years. And just imagine all the historical moments that happen at the largest level on the battlefields or at the smallest level in local communities. You can see then how corridos are going to be written about everything. Okay, so then corridos then have become one of my favorite genres. And when when I was writing my chapter on cockfighting and corridos, I played corridos nonstop for 4 or 5 hours just to write a couple pages, right? Because it helped me. Listen to corridos, writing about corridos, it just kind of got my juices flowing in order to write about a corrido, listening to that music. Okay, so enough about corridos. Beautiful genre. If you ever been to a Mexican restaurant, more than likely in the background they're playing a corrido of something. Okay, and so and you can often, for example, if any of you have the time later on, you can look up this corrido on the internet, Google it, and you can actually find a translation. If you don't speak Spanish, you can find the English translation. But I'll tell you this, though. When I done that for my students in my classes, and I read the English translation, it does not have the flavor, right, that the Spanish does. It kind of throws it way off, right? So I'm listening to the Spanish version, and then I go to the English version, and I go, nah, it's not conveying the same kind of feeling and emotion that you get from understanding Spanish and hearing the song in its actual language, right? But if you want to just know what the song's about and you don't read Spanish, go to the English translation, and that will help you. Okay, let's move on here. I think I'm going to have to exit out my... So what I want to do is I want to talk about demographics for a moment. And I'm going to try to get through some slides rather quickly and only slow down when I think it's necessary to point out some details, right? Because demographics is important. I often tell my students that when we're talking about Latinos in the United States, it's important to understand where they are, how many there are today, how many there were in the past, et cetera, so we can get a sense of their historical trajectory in the United States in regards to the population. Good. But I'm not going to linger too long on this slide, but I do want you to notice something here. Oh. These slides are roughly not quite 100 years apart, but pretty close, okay? And what I want you to notice are the groups that are coming into the United States in 1900 versus 2020, okay? So you can see on the left pie, right, 85% of all immigrants coming to the United States are coming from Europe, you know, white immigrants. And in this time period, 1900, it's primarily Eastern and Southern Europeans. And if you understand your history a little bit, especially immigration history, these are the groups that are going to have the target on their back, right, during this period in U.S. history. In fact, the United States will create 3 immigration acts in succession, 1917, 1921, and 1924, to exclude Eastern and Southern Europeans from immigrating to the United States, in addition to some other groups. But Eastern and Southern Europeans represent 85% of all the people coming in. If you look at Latinos, right, not even on the radar, right, 1 to 2% of all immigrants coming to the United States in the early 20th century are Mexicanos, right? And I'll mention this here in a little bit with a slide. What I want you also to understand is that in 2025, the Latino community is pretty diverse, right? We have Latinos in the United States from all over Latin America, right? 20 to 30 different countries, depending on how you define it. But in this time period, well into the middle of the 20th century, when we say Latinos during this era, we're really talking about Mexicans, because there aren't any Latino groups yet in the continental United States, except for Puerto Ricanos on the island of Puerto Rico, who are incorporated to the Spanish-American War of 1898. Right? So then we look at the pie on the right side, it's almost like a polar opposite view of what has taken place. The majority of the populations that are coming into the United States are people from Latin America, but also from Asia, right? And when you look at those population figures closer, those are the 2 largest, fastest growing populations in this country, are Latinos and Asians, right? But Latinos by a greater degree, but when we compare Latinos to other groups, it is Asians who are the second fastest growing population in the U.S. It's another slide to look at it differently. We can see the trajectory of populations from 1960 into the future, actually. These are projections into 2060. So one of the things then that what I like to do oftentimes, I know you're not a class of mine. Well, maybe you are for the next 30 minutes. I always like to plant little seeds in my students' minds without giving them the answer about anything, because I want them to think about it and work on what is being said with these slides, right? So when you look at this slide here, it also shows you the trajectory of the U.S. population, where it was in 1960, where the vast majority of the population was white in the U.S., and where it's going to be in 2060, right? Where the population back in 1960 was easily 65 to 70% white, where in 2060, the white population will be down to 43%, which means then there'll be a minority majority in the United States, right? So we need to let that sink in for a little bit, because I don't get into politics in this presentation very much, but just by saying what I just said, that's already political, right? You just got to understand what I just said and what you're viewing in this pie chart. So if we look at this chart in 2025, you can see the Latino population is about 20% right now of the total U.S. population, roughly, give or take 1%, right? In 2060, it will be what? 31%. Yeah, there. Thank you, Joe. Was that Joe? Thank you, sir. Yeah, 31%. Right? So you can see And we could get into a longer discussion about what is causing that. I gave you one already, right, which is immigration, but it's not the only reason, right? But that's for you good folks to figure out after this presentation. Okay. All right, then, of course, the concentration of Latinos in the United States here in the American Southwest, right? Again, for historical reasons, if you understand the history of Latinos, the first group ever incorporated into the United States through invasion and conquest were Mexicanos. And of course, where we're at today, usually part of Mexico. So then that tells us why then there's such a heavy concentration of Mexicanos in the American Southwest. But also in other regions, Illinois, New York, and Florida, right? And so if we look at those locations, we know there's a significant population of not just Mexicanos, but in Illinois, Puerto Ricanos. In New York, not just Mexicanos, but Puerto Ricanos, people from Dominican Republic, et cetera, and down in Florida, from many places in the Caribbean, as well as Colombia and Venezuela. Right? And again, to understand those movements, it's about history. Right? You understand the history of those groups when they arrived into those locations, let's say like Florida, you understand the history of that time period in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. It'll give you part of the answer why they migrated to the state of Florida. Yeah. And then here, this is a little, can everybody see that slide okay? It didn't come out as big as I wanted it to, but this breaks down the largest Latino groups in the United States. Right? So again, overwhelmingly it's Mexicano for historical reasons, right? Followed by Puerto Ricanos. Puerto Ricanos became U.S. citizens in 1917 through the Jones Act, and they reside both in the United States and on the island of Puerto Rico, right? A territory of the United States. Okay. Then we got people from El Salvador, from Cuba, Dominican. Hispanic refers to people whose origins is from Spain. Okay. Then we got Guatemaltecos, people from Colombia, and Honduras. Okay. And so again, you can look at the numbers up there. Mexicanos are overwhelmingly the largest group. But the biggest difference, though, that I do want to point out is that that began to change in the 1960s and 1970s when we began to have much more diversity in the Latino population. Now, one of the questions that always comes up, which we will not have time to go into today, is what caused that diversity? What caused so many other Latinos to come to the United States from other parts of Latin America? Again, it's about history. And I'll just give you one, or maybe two examples. One, the Cuban Revolution in 1959. There was an exodus of Cubanos in the 50s and 60s and again in the 1980s. Okay? And then if we want to look at, for example, places like Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, the civil wars that erupted in the 70s and 80s that pushed out a lot of those groups to the United States. Right? So it's always about cause and effect in regards to those groups. Right? Something happened that pushed them out, and they ended up here in the U.S. Okay? Okay, now we're going to bring it down to the Arizona level. So Arizona obviously has a significant Latino population. It's also diverse, but the majority are Mexicanos. I just wanted to list a couple things I found interesting. The most Hispanic or Latino city in Arizona is Somerton. How many people have ever been to Somerton or know where it's located? Yeah, it's down in the south by Yuma, right? It reminds me of McAllen, Texas. McAllen, Texas is almost identical to this. We're down in the border area where there's a community like McAllen or Somerton. Population is 95% Latino, right? But then you have the polar opposite. How many people have ever been to Fountain Hills? So I was actually there not by accident. I actually had an appointment in Scottsdale, and I saw a sign that said Fountain Hills. And then I was kind of intrigued by this community, right, because of what I was seeing. And what I was seeing was a lot of wealth, right? A lot of wealth. So, I'm in the market for a new home. So I Googled, what's the average price in Fountain Hills for a home? Almost $900,000 for a new home in Fountain Hills, right? So it's not a working class place for me, right? But it also tells you a little bit about the population, right? Without getting into the details, right? So you can understand that in Fountain Hills, 3.7, the least Latino city in Arizona. Okay? Arizona is 31% overall Latino, and Arizona is the fourth most Latino population in the United States. Now, real quickly here, a 30-second blurb. I've already mentioned terms like Hispanic, Latino, Chicano, right? These are all labels, right? These are all labels that some of them have been chosen by Latinos who identify as Chicano, like I do. I identify as a Chicano. Others are like the term Hispanic, right? Have not been chosen by Latinos, but have been designated by the U.S. government, right? So if we look at Hispanic, that was designated as a nomenclature for all people of Spanish-speaking ancestry back in 1973, right? And that's stuck, and it's still with us to this day, right? So some are self-imposed, like Hispanic, right? I'm not sorry, not self-imposed, but imposed, like Hispanic, and some are self-imposed, like Latino and Chicano, right? And those are just two. I mean, there's again, in my classes, we go over about at least a dozen different labels over the history of Chicanos, Latinos in the United States that have been attached to Spanish-speaking people, right? And there are a lot of them. Some are benign, like Hispanic, Latino, Chicano, but then some are very dangerous, very derogatory, right? And when I say, do you recognize the W word? Let's see the hands go up. Okay, so a lot of you do. Okay, so here we're in an educational setting, correct? This is kind of a safe space, correct? I'm assuming it is, right? So I'm gonna say the word out, but in quotations, right? So the W stands for the word wetback, okay? And briefly, what I want you to know about that word is that word became normalized in the United States, beginning in the early 20th century, well into the 1970s, right? And so it was a word then, and you can find this very easily. You can find it in a congressional record in Washington, D.C. You can find it in magazines, newspapers. I can guarantee you, I haven't done this, but I can guarantee you, you go to an Arizona newspaper in the 50s, 1960s, and instead of saying Mexican, they'll use the word wetback, okay? Because it became a normalized term during this time period. That all shifts with the civil rights movement, the Chicano movement in the 1960s and 1970s. So the point I'm trying to make is that being a Latino Chicano in the United States has come with a lot of that kind of baggage, right, that we've dealt with over the course of our history, is just dealing with labels. Right? Think about that, just a label. And unfortunately, our community, throughout time and history, we have fought over and over and over again about what to call ourselves, right? And again, I'll throw another quick little story. Joe mentioned that I was fortunate enough to be called in to Seattle to help create the first museum of Chicanos, Latinos in Washington State. We spent countless days and weeks just trying to figure out what to name our museum. We ended up with two terms, Chicano, Latino, right? But let me tell you, it took weeks and weeks and weeks and months to get to that point, where I think most of us just kind of threw our hands up and said, let's just go with Chicano, Latino, right? So it's still around to this day, the struggle of what to call ourselves. Okay. So here then we can break it down to the Glendale population. Just understand that the population in Glendale is 43% white and 40.5% Latino, right? So almost split, right? And then of course with a mix of other groups that I have listed here, okay? And thank you to Ms. Boone for sending me some of this information. It really helped. Okay, so contributions from antiquity, okay? So here we're going way back in time. We're going back to the indigenous period, right? And I'm gonna have a slide here with a lot of different images, and because of time, even if I hadn't gotten behind, we still would not have time to go into a lot of detail on this slide, right? So, but I'll try to do my best to point out some of the things that we have here. I don't know, can you see my green dot? Okay, so this is why then a lot of Chicanos, Latinos identify as indigenous, because this is the origins, right? So the way to conceptualize this is that if your ancestry is from Europe, right, you often look back into antiquity, and your version of antiquity are the Romans and Greeks, right? Well, the antiquity for Chicanos and Latinos are the Mesoamerican civilizations like the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Olmecas, the Toltecs, etc. And this is what I got displayed here, right? But just like if we were studying European history, if all we concentrated on were the Greeks and Romans, that would not give us the full history and flavor of what it was like to be of European ancestry. Nor is it the same here, right? If I was just to tell you that all Chicanos Latinos originated from these 5 major groups, that wouldn't be historically accurate. These are just the 5 groups that rose to the top and created what anthropologists call sophisticated societies. And they were very sophisticated. But simultaneously, right, no matter what time period we're talking about, there were hundreds of other tribes coexisting, right? Either as part of these city-states or on their own. Okay, so we can't forget that. And then I told you I identify as a Chicano, right? And I can tell you, almost every Chicano I ever met in my life tells me that they're from the Aztecs, which is not accurate, right? Because we know that the Aztecs were located down in what is today Mexico City, right? Most Chicanos are not from that area. Most Chicanos are from the border region. Right? So if Chicanos identify as indigenous, they're part of what we call today the Southwestern tribes. Apache, Comanche, right? Navajo, Hopi, right? Except my mother's part Hopi, right? So I claim a little bit of that, although I don't claim it all because I didn't grow up Hopi. I didn't grow up with culture. I grew up with Mexican culture, right? But as I always tell people when I have these kind of discussions, when you look at me, you don't confuse me as white, right? You look at me and I'm often categorized either as indigenous or Asian, right? One of those two, right? Which can both be true. And if I have a lot of time, I tell you how much can both be true. but just understand then, when we're talking about indigeneity of Chicanos and Latinos, it's from everywhere, right? And of course, what Chicanos do, and some Chicanas, right, is they romanticize the Aztecs, right? But when you understand who the Aztecs were, you don't want to romanticize them, right? Because they're the group that's in power before the Europeans arrive, right? And one of the things I'll tell you about the Aztecs, there's 2 things I'll tell you, is that they were brutal, right? They were conquerors. They were imperialists, right? They conquered tribes and forced you in, right? But at the same time, their architecture, beautiful. Engineering, magnificent. The canals, that island they created, an island where they were supposed to disappear and be destroyed, they created their capital, Tenochtitlan, which is located, this is the image of it right here. Right here. That's the island that used to be known as the capital city, Tenochtitlan. Today, and it was in that water, the body of water, was known as Lake Texcoco. And I forgot there's a mic right in front of me. Thank you, David. And today, Tenochtitlan is what we call Mexico City. The Spaniards drained that lake long ago, right? When they first went into the area, conquered it, they drained the lake, right? And the only reason why we know Tenochtitlan was there is because of the 1968 Summer Olympics. When Mexico was creating their subway, they ran into the foundation of Tenochtitlan, right? And were able to create this model of what it looked like. Plus, we also had some drawings from Hernan Cortez and his men when they first came in to the area, right? So Tenochtitlan was this beautiful place that belonged to this very brutal empire, right? So that's why I always tell people, don't romanticize the Aztecs, right? Should I emphasize that a little more with a story? What do you guys think? You want to hear a story? This is an example, right, of what the Aztecs did in order to conquer, right? So the group that was in power, in fact, the group that tried to destroy the Aztecs, by the way, they weren't known as the Aztecs yet. They were known as the Mexica, which is where we get the word Mexico from, the Mexica, right? So the Mexica are the only group up here of all the five they call them the five sons. The Mexica are the one group that is not from central Mexico. They're from somewhere up north. We don't know the exact location. But the Mexica migrated into central Mexico, and the group that was in power were the Toltecs. And so after a lot of years and skirmishes and battles and wars, the Toltecs and the Mexica came to an agreement that they would have a marriage that would combine their empires. Because that's how it was done throughout the world, right? Marriages were a way to forge alliances. And so the Mexica and the Toltecs agreed to this. And it was customary for the bride to spend the night in the groom's household. So this is what occurred. But the next morning, as the groups were converging on each other for this marriage, the Mexica priest was in front, and instead of the bride being there, it was the priest wearing the flayed skin of the bride. So that was a message being sent to the Toltecs from the Mexica, right? And I'm going to use kind of street language. Don't get offended. So basically what they were saying was, we're the baddest in this area, and we know we can kick your ass. And we just did this to your daughter. What are you going to do about it? Right? That's the message that the Mexica were sending to the Toltecs. They wanted a battle. They wanted to fight because they didn't want to share power. And they won. They conquered the Toltecs, and they became the top dog, and they became known as the Aztec Empire. For the next 200 years, that's how they would rule, right? But again, there's that brutality side of them, but then there's that beautiful side of them, right? That coexisted with them, that they were, conquerors, brutally conquered, but they built these magnificent pyramids, these aqueducts, right? That brought in fresh water, that connected their capital to the mainland, right? So engineering then was a major feat for a lot of these groups, not just the Aztecs. Right? And so because the Aztecs then were from the outside region, they borrowed a lot from the other four sons that were in place. So let me talk real quickly about them because I know I am running out of time here. So then, to me, from my personal perspective, there are two groups that stand out even further than the Aztecs. And that is Teotihuacan, the creators of the second largest pyramids in the world, located about 25 kilometers northeast of Mexico City. This is an image here of the sun, of the moon, and the Avenue of the Dead, right? And of course, they were in existence probably about 1,000 years before the Aztecs emerged. And the Aztecs were familiar with them. So the Aztecs would every year pay homage, go to this ceremonial center and pay homage to the Toltecs. But the one group that stands out more than any other are the Mayans. I have a separate slide for them that I'll get to in a second. But we also can't forget the Taino people and Arawak people in the Caribbean who migrated thousands of years from northern South America throughout the Caribbean area. And the one thing that you should know about that is that when Europeans come in and invade and conquer, that is first contact. It is the Caribbean, right? And of course, the consequences of that are huge. And if I get a moment, I'll mention a couple of those consequences. And then, of course, we have the Inca Empire that was completely separate from central Mexico and the Five Sons. But the Inca Empire was also another one of those groups that rose to magnificent heights, but were also conquered by the Spaniards about a decade after the Aztecs. Let me see, who did I forget? Okay, the Olmecas. The Olmecas up here in what is today the area of Veracruz, they stand out because they're the first group that left a written record behind, right? And of course, they're known as the developers of these large, colossal heads that most of them now reside in the Museum of Natural History in Mexico City. Okay, this is why the Mayans stand out. Is that first of all, they're the only one of three civilizations in world history that developed the concept of zero. Okay? And that was critical for the Mayans because when they developed the concept of zero, it allowed them to use their mathematical abilities, not only for engineering, but more importantly, to study the stars and planets. Right? And so then when we look at this, and first of all, a little caveat, disclaimer, I am not an expert on Mayan writing or the number system. I know the basics, and that's what I'm going to give you. so bear with me. So then the counting system is a 20-based counting system. But their calendar is very similar to ours today. Right? Their calendar, using a 20-based counting system, equal 365 days. And so when we look at this very basic counting system, the dots represent ones. So if we look at this number at the top, we understand that the bar equals 5, that number is 18. Okay? So 5 plus 5 plus 5 is 15, plus 3 dots is 18. Okay? Now the thing that throws a lot of people off, including me, the shells represent 0 or a placeholder in their counting system. Right? The other thing I'll mention about the Mayans that helps us understand them a little bit, when we look at the origin stories of indigenous groups throughout the Americas, again, throughout the whole Western Hemisphere, an overwhelming majority have origin stories, right? Not of a migration. Western science talks about this Bering Strait hypothesis. Most indigenous populations don't believe in that. They believe in their own origin stories in which they came somewhere from the underground. Right? For example, we were just talking about the Aztecs. Their origin story talks about the 7 caves of the underground where they emerged. Right? The Mayans, their origin story is actually called Popol Vuh, right? And their origin story is they came from the cosmos, not from the underground. Okay, so very, very different from almost every other indigenous group that we have in the Americas. Here, I just got the other 2 groups, the Babylonians and Indians, that also developed the concept of zero separately from each other. And of course, the Mayans being thousands and thousands of miles away from these areas, it's very clear to see that. Sticking with the indigenous cultures for a moment here and moving forward, though, in time. There's a book up there called Zapotec Science that was written by Roberto Gonzalez probably a good 15 years ago. But for those of you that aren't familiar with this, maize, or what most of you probably recognize as corn, was domesticated in Mexico about 9,000 or 10,000 years ago. And then, of course, we know now corn is a staple crop throughout the world, right? As is potatoes that came from the Inca Empire. So then, what I'm going to do is read this text real quick and just kind of leave you thinking about that. So the Zapotec people of Oaxaca, and I got a map over here, have continuously cultivated maize, bean, squash, and other crops for more than 5,000 years. However, maize domesticated in central Mexico 10,000 years ago. Evidence strongly indicates that their ancient Mesoamerican ancestors domesticated maize from a wild grass, and that its propagation and improvement required a level of human intervention so sophisticated that has been described as the most remarkable plant breeding accomplished of all time. Right? And I think a lot of people would agree with that if you understand, if you saw a picture of corn or what it looked like 9,000 years ago, you would not recognize it. Has anybody ever seen a stalk of wheat? Of wheat. Okay, it's very small, right? But that's what corn looked like 10,000 years ago. And then through cultivation and breeding over millions of years, not millions, thousands of years, it became to what we recognize today, right? But back in this time period, it looked very, very differently. But through time and cultivation, it becomes the corn that we have in the contemporary period. The last thing I'll mention up there is on the top right is a court that we call in history the Mesoamerican ball game. And this ball game is a cross between basketball and soccer, right? And you find these not only in Oaxaca, but you find them throughout Latin America. So we know that it's a sport that was used and it traded throughout the region, right? Because you'll find ball courts in the Caribbean. You'll find ball courts in South America and throughout what we call today Mexico and Central America. Okay, I cannot stay very long on this slide. The colonial period of Latin America is older than the history of the United States. 300 years, right? But this is what I tell students. If you want to know about Latinos, you have to understand this time period, right? Because this is where a big shift happens. So when the Europeans invade and conquer the area, you're going to have what we call a syncretism, or a mixing of cultures, right? Not only through food, but biologically, right? This is when you begin to see the emergence of the offspring between Europeans and the native population that are often identified in books as mestizos, okay? But I think what's more important for us to understand in this very brief moment that we have is understanding the culture that emerges, right? Because more importantly, is that there's going to be a mixing, a syncretism of religiosity between indigenous religious beliefs and Catholicism. That's how we end up with La Virgen de Guadalupe, right? La Virgen de Guadalupe is a merging of indigenous religiosity and Catholicism. And there's a huge story behind this. I should just tell you right now that if you want to hear the story, sign up for my class. Because we don't have time today, unfortunately. Take my class, or you can come audit it. I'll let you take it for free, right? So La Virgen de Guadalupe, right? Very, very important. Image of the conquest, right? So literally, this is the final siege of Tenochtitlan by the Spaniards. And it was literally every man, woman, and child fighting against the European invaders, right? At the very end, right? And here's why. It's because when you look at this here, this is what decimated the indigenous population. Long before 1521 was the introduction of European diseases, right? And it was a massive die-off, right? And this is why then when you look at this image and you understand the history, that it's primarily children and women fighting, because all the men have been killed, either through warfare or through disease, okay? And then, of course, this is the last thing I'll say. I got to switch slides. Is within 150 years of the conquest, 90% of all the indigenous population in what we call today Central Mexico, which was 25 million people, by the way, is decimated, 90%. And that's the model that we see, right, throughout the Americas, where Europeans come in and indigenous people have no immunity to their diseases. And I mentioned earlier, first contact was the Caribbean. That's why the Arawak and Taino are difficult to find today, is because there was a 90% decimation of those groups when? 1492, right? 25 years before we see the conquest of what we call today Mexico. Okay. So the colonial period, you can see then, is filled with important historical events that helps you understand the Chicano-Latino experience. But more importantly, religion, La Virgen de Guadalupe, right? She's an icon. Right? She's probably in the top 3 of most important icons in the Western Hemisphere, right? Because it's not just Mexicanos that worship her, but Latin Americans throughout the region, because she is considered the patron saint of Latin America, not just Mexico. And so then, quickly here, look this up later on your own. These are casta paintings. This refers to the various groups that are going to emerge because of European contact, miscegenation, right? And the offspring that are being created. You gotta remember the time period we're talking about. We're talking about, the 17th century, the 18th century. There were no photographs at this time period. There were no TikTok films, right? So what the Europeans did, because of the curiosity, they sent over artists to paint pictures of these offsprings that were created through these relationships. And they're known today as casta paintings or caste paintings. Okay? That's part of the history. I know we're running out of time. So let me ask a question real quick. Are there any questions right now? Okay, because I was going to leave time for Q&A, but if there are no questions, we'll keep charging on. Okay, tell me your first name. Okay, yeah, that tells you the importance, right? I had a kind of story to go along with that. Ex-girlfriend. You guys want to hear ex-girlfriend story real quick? When she saw my medallion at the Virgen de Guadalupe, she goes, I'm not sure if I wanted to hear this, but she goes, I haven't met a Chicano who doesn't have a tattoo of the Virgen de Guadalupe or a medallion, right? So which is going back to this gentleman's comment, and there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, we could have a whole day discussion just on the Virgen de Guadalupe. She's such an important icon for a variety of reasons, right? But also understand, like all the history that I've been giving you today, right? We can be critical about it. We can look at it and then talk about European conquest and invasion, the consequences it had on the Americas, right? We could talk about La Virgen de Guadalupe. We can break her story down and look at the impact she has had on women in the Americas, all the way to the contemporary period, et cetera. We could do all of that, right? But we don't have time for that today. I wish we did, right? Because we'd all walk away, right? We'd either be fighting, right? Because of the criticisms, especially about La Virgen de Guadalupe, or disagreeing about some of the history. Okay. Independence movements. I'm not going to linger here, right? Independence movements. Most of Latin America that we know today became independent between 1804 to the 1830s, okay? This year, the first Latino group are Chicanos, people of Mexican ancestry who were invaded and conquered by the United States in the 1830s, 1840s, and then what becomes the American Southwest, as we know, used to be part of northern Mexico. Contributions. So I jump real quickly here. Now we're just talking about La Virgen de Guadalupe from the colonial period. Now we're in the early part of the 20th century. So you can see I leaps and bounds, as they say, leaps and bounds. But I do want to emphasize something that's very important on this slide. They're all important, right? So when we look at the first half of the 20th century, now it's been a good 50 or 60 years since the incorporation of Chicanos and Latinos into the United States, right? And we're looking at these images. There's no doubt that even to this day, one of the greatest contributions that Chicanos, Chicanas, Latinos have made is the labor they have provided to this country, right? All the way to the contemporary period, okay? That's depicted by these World War II. This is a bracero worker, by the way. Braceros were workers that were brought into the United States during World War II to help with the war effort. But simultaneously, you had Chicanas working during World War II, right? And I don't think anybody would guess what this crop is. If you do, I'll give you my lunch. What's one of the major ingredients in beer? Hops, right? These are hops, right? For the troops, I guess, they got to have beer even though they're at war, right? They got to have beer, right? So the point is that over 500 to 600,000 Latinos and Latinas joined the war effort, but on the home front, they were doing this kind of labor, right? But here then, on the right side, is really what I want to emphasize. Because when we talk about the contributions of Chicanos, Latinos, absolutely labor. There's no doubt about that. And we can go through every decade and see it. But what most people don't recognize are the contributions that Chicanos, Latinos made to the desegregation of this country. That began with one important case in Lemon Grove, California, close to San Diego in 1931, known as the Lemon Grove Incident. This began the process of desegregation in the United States. And there's another important case that happens in the 40s called Mendez versus Westminster in California as well in 1947. That's even more important, right? And what I want you to also recognize, the landmark case, which is probably what most people recognize, is Brown versus Board of Education, the 1954 landmark case that desegregated the whole country. Well, when you look at that case, right, you understand that the lead attorney was Thurgood Marshall, right, who would become the first African-American Supreme Court justice. Right? But here he was the attorney for the NAACP who brought this lawsuit. And when you look at his case, you'll see that he's using Mexican desegregation cases to bolster his claim. And the basic claim is this to the Supreme Court in 1954, is that, look, states are already desegregating. You can see it in California, Lemon Grove. You can see it in California, Westminster. You can see it in Texas. So the ball is rolling where desegregation is occurring. What we're doing in this particular case in 54 is making the argument that we should desegregate the whole country. Okay, and that's what happens with 1954 case, Brown versus Board, right? So then this is very, very important case law, right, that very few people recognize. But I want to be sure that when you walk out of here today, that this is one of the major contributions that Latinos have made to the development of the United States, is creating a more equal and just system when it comes to especially the education of children. Joe gave me the hook, so I'm running out of time. World War II, as I already mentioned, huge contribution by Latinos, all Americans in general, right? But here we're celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month, right? We had nearly 600,000 Latinos and Latinas join the war effort during World War II. I do have a clip that I'm going to have to bypass because of time, right? But this clip kind of emphasizes what I just said, the contributions. And then I emphasize, it's actually going to start on me. I'm going to have to skip it, I'm sorry. Oops. But I also want to emphasize the Latinas that hardly ever get credit for their contributions to the war effort, right? So we had Latinas throughout the country involved in the war industries depicted by the first one. How many people have heard of this term, Rosie the Riveter? Rosie the Riveter. Yeah, so Latinas played that role as well, right? They worked in all the war industries. But they also enlisted, right? Because they weren't drafted because they were women, so they enlisted and volunteered for the armed forces throughout the region, throughout the country, and were deployed to all the theaters of war. And this is just sampling of some of those women. We got one or two from Arizona that I have depicted here. Right? So I wanted to be sure that we understand that women, just as Latino men, participated and contributed to the war effort. Community development in and around Glendale. The one guy we'll linger on is Mike Gomez, the World War II vet that we got on the top right. He turned 100 in January 2025. Unfortunately, he passed away last month, right? But he was one of the few last remaining World War II veterans in the country, right? Not the last, because there's still a few thousand that's still alive, but he was one of the few, and of course he was honored tremendously. He was on Omaha Beach. He did all the major battles. He was under the command of General Patton. So he had a storied history when it comes to World War II. And I think he's not actually from Glendale. I think he's from Tempe. But that's close enough, man, right? That's close enough. And then we got just other community development. We got a quinceañera on the left bottom. We got, of course, a boxer, right? Alex Fimbres. We got at the very top the Calderon Ballroom. That's actually a picture of some of you who are in the know of Little Joe and the Familia, right? A very famous band from the 60s and 70s playing at the Calderon Ballroom. So it tells us about cultural development, right? And community formation here in Glendale region. And this is how it is everywhere. Wherever you study a Chicano Latino community, you're going to see stuff like this. And of course, we could have traced it back even further in time to look at this community formation, but this is a good example where it's happening in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention some of the food, right? How many of you knew yesterday was National Taco Day? I didn't know that until one of my students told me that it was National Taco Day. So that here we got, obviously, a lot of different forms of culture. Ballet Folclórico, Dia de los Muertos, which is coming up real soon. We got salsa. We got Bad Bunny coming up for the... I have to plug him in, man. He's, of course, the major performance for the Super Bowl in February. And then we got the Breakfast of Champions here, menudo, right? And then, of course, art. One of my favorite mediums to translate culture is through art. That's actually Chicano Park in Barrio Logan, down by San Diego. Beautiful, beautiful place to see art, etc. And then I think I'm out of time. Am I correct, Joe? You guys got time for one more slide? One more slide. Yeah, this is the one that I told Joe about, that it's going to scare you, right? So I'm warning you. It's going to scare you. How many people have ever heard of the Alcumberry Drive? The Alcumberry Warp Drive. Developed in 1994 by a Mexican physicist by the name of Miguel Alcubierre. And it's considered the leading case for the development of faster-than-light travel. Why? Because it does not break any of the laws of Einstein's theory of relativity, right? So the science is there, the math works out. Because our time on Earth is finite. That beautiful sun that we have in 1.5 billion years is going to make our planet uninhabitable. So we are going to need to find a different place to live. And the only way that's going to happen is interstellar travel through faster-than-light travel. Because speed of light, that's chump change compared to faster-than-light travel, right? So then the point here is this, is that we have Latinos throughout the country, throughout the world, in the hard sciences, creating cutting-edge technology and theories. And this is one that, in my opinion, 50 or 60 years will become a reality. There's one ingredient that's missing. It's exotic matter known as dark energy. Dark energy was what will make this theory into reality. And scientists all over the world are trying to detect dark energy as we speak. But until that is developed, until that is found, Alcumberry Drive will remain just on the drawing books. But it's theoretically possible. And I hope it is created because, again, everything that we know today in 5 billion years, our Earth will be vaporized by the sun when it becomes a red giant. Right? And I know that sounds like a long time from now, right? 5 billion years. But think about the future generations. Okay. Gracias. I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Garcia, for sharing your knowledge and insights with us today. Your work reminds us how history, culture, and community come together to shape who we are. And we're grateful for the perspective you've brought to our Hispanic Heritage Month event. We would like to present you with a token of our appreciation.
All right. Nice. Thank you.
Also like to thank you all for joining us and making time for this. And thanks again to the Diversity Committee members. Events like this are a chance to reflect, learn, and honor the many contributions of Hispanic and Latino communities, not just during this month, but throughout the year. As we continue to serve our community, let's carry forward the spirit of Hispanic Heritage Month, celebrating diversity, fostering inclusion, and recognizing the rich cultural legacies that strengthen our city and workplace. We're also currently having a GHN membership drive. We need your help to continue putting on quality educational programs like this for employees. Also stay tuned for our next event. It's going to be Indigenous Peoples Day in about a month from now. Thank you again and have a wonderful day.